A wealthy businessman handed $200 to a struggling mother so she could buy food for her child. The next morning, he found her kneeling at the grave of his beloved, who had passed away 23 years ago. Michael Carter sat alone at a table in one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants. Despite the opulence surrounding him, none of it filled the emptiness inside. He swirled the wine in his glass absent-mindedly, staring out the rain-streaked window. The city was gray and lifeless, a perfect reflection of how he felt. For more than 2 decades, his world had been in a permanent state of mourning. Ever since his wife, Laura, had died tragically, Michael had not been able to move on. The success, the money, the empire he had built, it all felt hollow. He went through the motions, attending business meetings, shaking hands, closing deals. But at the end of every day, he returned home to nothing but silence. He sighed, rubbing his temple. The restaurant buzzed with chatter and laughter, but it was nothing more than background noise to him. He settled the bill, put on his coat, and stepped out into the rain. Cold droplets tapped against his skin, but he barely noticed. As he walked down the familiar streets, he passed by places he and Laura used to visit together. Each building, each street corner, held memories of a time that felt like a different lifetime. Now, there was nothing left but echoes of the past. Tomorrow, like most days, he would visit Laura's grave. Although she could have been laid to rest in Paris, she had chosen New York. Perhaps because this city was where they had started their life together. A life that had been cut short far too soon. As he trudged down the rain-soaked sidewalk, something caught his eye. Under the awning of a small store, a young woman sat huddled, clutching a baby to her chest. Her damp hair clung to her face, and her frail form made her look even more vulnerable. Something about the scene tugged at Michael's heart. He hesitated, not used to involving himself in such situations. Over the years, he had donated to countless charities, but helping someone face to face? That was different. Yet, something about her made him stop. Maybe it was the way she held the child, so protectively, so full of love. It stirred something inside him, something he thought had long since faded. Without a word, Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out a few crisp bills, $350, freshly withdrawn from an ATM. He extended the money toward her. "Here," he said. "Use this to get some food for you and your baby." The young woman's eyes widened in shock before softening into gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice unsteady. "Thank you so much." For a brief moment, Michael felt a flicker of warmth in his otherwise cold world. He gave her a small nod before walking away, but the image of her and her child stayed with him. As he continued down the street, he could not shake the feeling that something about that encounter had shifted something deep inside him. That night, as he lay in bed listening to the rain tap against the window, he could not stop thinking about her. It was as if something long dormant had stirred to life. Tomorrow, like always, he would visit Laura's grave. But he had no idea that this visit would change everything. The next morning, Michael followed his usual routine. He woke early, dressed in a sharp gray suit, and stepped out into the damp morning air. The city still bore the traces of last night's rain, and the overcast sky mirrored the heaviness in his heart. He buttoned his coat and set off toward the cemetery, the familiar weight of grief settling in his chest. As he walked, his thoughts kept drifting back to the woman and her baby. He had encountered plenty of people in need before, yet something about her lingered in his mind. There had been something in her expression, desperation, yes, but something else, too. Something he could not quite name. Arriving at the cemetery, he took the familiar path to Laura's grave. The place was silent, save for the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. It was a routine he knew too well: stand before the headstone, speak to her as if she were still there, then leave, feeling just as empty as before. But today was different. As he approached, he saw someone already there, kneeling in front of Laura's grave. His heart skipped a beat. It was the young woman from the night before, holding her baby close, her shoulders trembling as if she were crying. Michael froze. How did she know about Laura? The coincidence was too great, too unsettling. His mind raced as he cautiously stepped forward, an uneasy feeling settling deep in his gut. Michael cleared his throat, his voice uncertain. "Excuse me?" The woman flinched, startled. Her eyes were red and swollen, and she quickly wiped her face with the sleeve of her worn jacket. "I am sorry," she murmured, trying to steady herself. "I did not mean to intrude." Michael shook his head, still struggling to make sense of what he was witnessing. "You were outside the restaurant yesterday," he said slowly. "I gave you money." She nodded, glancing down at the baby in her arms as if that alone was explanation enough. But for Michael, it was not. He needed to understand why this woman, this complete stranger, was here, at Laura's grave. "Why are you here?" he asked, his tone firmer now. "How do you know Laura?" The woman hesitated for a moment, as if deciding whether or not to answer. Then, taking a deep breath, she met his gaze. Her eyes were filled with something indescribable, a mix of sorrow and determination. "Laura was my mother," she said softly. Michael felt the world tilt beneath him. His breath caught in his throat, and for a brief moment, he wondered if he had misheard her. "Your mother?" he repeated, barely above a whisper. "That is not possible. Laura never had a child." The woman shook her head, her expression unreadable. "She did," she said, her voice quiet yet steady. "She had me. She just never told you." Michael's world came to a screeching halt. His mind raced, trying to process her words, but none of it made sense. Laura could not have had a child. She would have told him. She would not have kept something like that from him. Or would she? He took a step back, the weight of the revelation crashing down on him. "No," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "That cannot be right. There is no way." "I know this is hard to believe," the woman said gently. "But it is the truth. My name is Sarah. Laura was my mother." Michael's chest tightened as her words began to sink in. He looked at the woman, Sarah, and then at the baby in her arms. His mind swarmed with questions, but he could not find the right one to ask first. "Why?" he finally managed, his voice breaking. "Why did she keep this from me?" Sarah looked down, sadness washing over her features. "I do not know," she admitted. "I never got to meet her. She died before I could ever know her. I was raised by another family." Michael's pulse pounded in his ears. For over 2 decades he had mourned Laura, believing he had known everything about her. And now, out of nowhere, he was faced with the possibility that she had kept a secret so massive, it changed everything. A secret that had been buried with her all these years. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I do not understand," he said, shaking his head. "Why now? Why are you here?" Sarah met his gaze, and for the first time, Michael saw something familiar in her face. A flicker of Laura's features. "I found out about her a few months ago," she explained. "I have been trying to put the pieces together ever since. And when I learned where she was buried, I had to come." Michael continued to stare at her, his emotions a whirlwind of disbelief, anger, and confusion. But beneath it all, there was something else, a glimmer of hope. Hope that, perhaps, not all was lost. That maybe, in some way, his connection to Laura had not disappeared entirely. His eyes flickered to the baby in Sarah's arms, and something inside him shifted. If Sarah was telling the truth, if Laura really had been her mother, then this child was his grandchild. A part of Laura that still lived on. For the first time in years, Michael felt something other than grief. He did not know what to say, but he knew one thing. His life had just changed in ways he never could have imagined. Michael stood frozen, staring at Sarah. His mind still reeled from what she had just told him. The wind stirred the fallen leaves around the cemetery, but all he could hear was the pounding of his own heartbeat. The baby in Sarah's arms let out a soft whimper, breaking the silence and snapping Michael from his daze. How is this possible?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His thoughts were a tangled mess. He felt betrayed by Laura's memory, as if the woman he had loved, the one he had grieved for all these years, had been someone entirely different. But even in his confusion, he could see one thing clearly: Sarah truly believed what she was saying. "I know this is a lot to take in," Sarah said gently, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. "I have spent my whole life trying to understand, too. But I am telling you the truth. Laura was my mother." Michael's chest ached. Why did she not tell me? He muttered, mostly to himself. The idea that Laura had kept something so significant from him was unbearable. He had spent countless nights wondering what their life could have been if things had been different. Now, it seemed, those thoughts had taken on a whole new, painful meaning. Sarah shook her head, her expression filled with quiet understanding. "I do not know why she never told you. I never had the chance to ask her. She passed away when I was still a baby." Michael tried to focus, to make sense of the situation. There had to be more to the story. "Who raised you then?" he asked. "If Laura was your mother, why did I never know about you?" Sarah hesitated, shifting uncomfortably as if the answer itself was too heavy to bear. "After she died, I was placed in the care of another family. I grew up not knowing anything about my real parents until recently." Michael felt a deep ache settle into his bones. He had spent so many years believing his past was set in stone, that the love he had lost was final, that there was nothing more to uncover. But standing here now, in front of Laura's grave, everything he thought he knew had been turned upside down. And he had no idea what to do next. Michael's breath felt heavy in his chest as Sarah continued, her voice steady yet tinged with emotion. "All I had was a name and a few scattered details. I did not even know where to start looking for you until a few months ago." Michael swallowed hard. He had spent decades believing he knew everything about Laura, only to find out there were parts of her life he had never been allowed to see. "So you came here looking for answers?" he asked quietly. Sarah nodded. "Yes. I wanted to understand who she was. I wanted to know why she kept me a secret. And when I found out where she was buried, I knew I had to come." Michael's gaze fell to the headstone, Laura's name etched into the cold, unyielding stone. For so long, he had made this pilgrimage, standing here, speaking to her as if she could still hear him, trying to find peace in her absence. But now, standing here with Sarah and the baby, that peace felt shattered. Everything felt different: his memories, his grief, even his understanding of Laura herself. He took a deep breath, searching for something solid in the storm of emotions raging inside him. "And this baby?" Michael's voice wavered as he gestured toward the child in Sarah's arms. "Is this my grandchild?" Sarah looked down at the baby, and for the first time, a soft smile broke through the tension on her face. "Yes," she said gently. "His name is Daniel." Michael stared at the infant, so small, so fragile. A rush of emotions flooded him: shock, disbelief, but also something else. Something unfamiliar after all these years. Hope. Daniel was a connection to Laura, to the life they could have had. A life that had been kept from him, but that he now had a chance to embrace. As he processed this revelation, the weight of it all threatened to crush him. He had spent so long living in the past, mourning Laura and the life they had lost. Now he realized that life had continued without him. It had moved forward in silence, and only now was he being given a chance to step into it. But the sting of betrayal still lingered. How could Laura have kept this from him? How could she have made such a monumental decision without telling him she was pregnant? "I do not understand," Michael said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Why would she hide you from me? Why would she go through this alone?" Sarah's face softened, but there was deep sadness in her eyes. "I do not know the details, but I can guess. Maybe she thought you would not want the responsibility of a child. Maybe she believed you were too focused on your business to be a father. I do not know, Michael. I wish I did." Michael shook his head, the weight of her words pressing against his chest. "But she should have given me a choice. She should have let me decide." Sarah nodded slowly. "Maybe she was scared. Maybe she did not know how to tell you. Or maybe she thought she was protecting you. The idea that Laura had hidden this out of some misguided sense of protection left Michael feeling conflicted. He had always believed Laura trusted him, that they had been partners in everything. But now, he was beginning to realize there were parts of her he had never truly known. Michael's eyes met Sarah's once more, and for the first time, he felt a deep connection, not just to her, but to the life he had never known existed. To the possibilities that had been lost but could now, perhaps, be reclaimed. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah hesitated, then met his gaze with quiet resolve. "I do not want anything from you. I just want to know where I came from. And I think you deserve to know the truth about your wife." Michael nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling in. The truth about Laura. A truth he had spent years living without. He did not know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain. His life had just changed forever. And for the first time in a long time, maybe that was not such a bad thing. Michael stood in stunned silence, unable to fully comprehend the weight of what Sarah had just revealed. Laura had a daughter, his daughter, a life he had never known about, hidden from him all these years. The betrayal stung, but it was layered with confusion, regret, and something else he had not expected: responsibility. Sarah and the baby in her arms were living proof of a past he had been excluded from. But they were here now, standing right in front of him. "I still do not understand," Michael finally said, his voice quieter now. The sharp edge of anger faded into something softer. "Laura never told me she was pregnant. How could she have kept this from me?" Sarah's eyes flickered with empathy. "I do not know what her reasons were, Michael. I have asked myself the same question over and over again, but I never found any answers. All I know is that she made that choice, and it affected both of us." Michael took a deep breath, his thoughts swirling. Laura had always been private, even with him. They had argued about how much she kept to herself, but this was a secret on a level he could not have imagined. "Do you know anything about her? About why she did it?" he asked, his voice hesitant, almost afraid of the answer. Sarah sighed, looking down at the baby in her arms. "I wish I knew more. The people who raised me did not know much about her either. I have spent the last few months trying to piece together what happened, and there are so many gaps. But I know one thing for sure: she loved you." Michael's eyes widened. "She told you that?" "No," Sarah said softly, shaking her head. "But I have seen it in everything I have learned about her, the way she talked about you to people, the way she lived her life. It was always clear that you were important to her, even if she kept you in the dark about some things." Michael clenched his jaw, frustration and sadness intertwining. He had spent years trying to make peace with Laura's death, believing he had accepted the life they had lost. But now, he was not just grieving her, he was grieving the life he never even knew existed. The daughter he had never been given the chance to raise. "And you, why now?" Michael asked, his voice strained. "Why did you decide to find me?" Sarah met his gaze with a calmness that surprised him. "I did not find out about Laura being my mother until a few months ago. Before that, all I had was a name and a vague story about how I was adopted. When I learned the truth, I knew I had to come here to find out more about who I am and where I came from. And to be honest, I was not sure what I would find." Michael's breath caught in his throat. He could see the weight Sarah carried in her eyes, the burden of a past she had never had access to. A burden that had now become his to bear as well. He glanced at the baby in Sarah's arms, now fast asleep. The small rise and fall of the child's chest seemed almost surreal to Michael. This was his grandson. His blood. A continuation of the life he had shared with Laura, even if it had been hidden from him for all these years. "Daniel," Sarah said suddenly, as if reading his thoughts. "His name is Daniel." Michael's eyes softened as he looked at the baby. "Daniel," he repeated quietly. The name felt strange on his tongue, but it was also grounding in a way he had not expected. For so long, he had felt adrift, moving through life without any real purpose. But now, as he stood here with Sarah and Daniel, something shifted inside him. I did not come here to ask for anything, Sarah continued, breaking Michael from his thoughts. I am not expecting you to play a role in my life or in Daniel's life. I just needed to know the truth. I needed to understand where I came from, and now I do. Michael stared at her, emotions swelling in his chest. He was not sure what Sarah expected from him, but he knew one thing: he could not just walk away from this. He could not walk away from her. You are my daughter, Michael said, the words feeling foreign and heavy in his mouth. He had never imagined himself saying those words, certainly not like this, standing in a cemetery in front of Laura's grave. And that makes Daniel my grandson. Sarah looked at him cautiously, unsure of where he was going with this. I have spent my whole life building something, Michael continued, his voice soft but resolute. But none of it ever really mattered. Not in the way I thought it would. After Laura died, I did not have anything left. But now, maybe I still have a chance to change that. Maybe I still have a chance to be something more than just a businessman. Sarah blinked, her expression a mixture of surprise and uncertainty. What are you saying? I am saying that if you will let me, I want to be part of your life, Michael said, his voice breaking slightly. I have missed so much already, but I do not want to miss any more. Sarah stared at him, her face unreadable for a long moment. Michael could see the hesitation in her eyes, the fear of opening herself up to someone she had never known. But there was also a flicker of something else. Hope. A hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be the beginning of something new. I do not know if it will be easy, Sarah said finally, her voice soft. There is a lot we do not know about each other. Michael nodded. I know. But I am willing to try if you are. Sarah looked down at Daniel, then back up at Michael. Okay, she said quietly. We can try. For the first time in years, Michael felt a small spark of warmth in his chest. It was not much, but it was enough to give him hope that maybe, despite all the loss and pain, there was still something left for him to hold on to. As Michael walked away from the cemetery that day, his mind was a storm of emotions. The revelation that Laura had kept such a monumental secret from him gnawed at him, and the thought of Sarah and Daniel lingered in his mind. His life, once so controlled and predictable, felt as if it had been flipped upside down in a matter of hours. The city around him carried on as usual, bustling with life, but Michael moved through it as though he were on autopilot. The encounter with Sarah had shaken him to his core, forcing him to question everything he thought he knew about his past. As much as he wanted to feel angry, to feel betrayed by Laura, he could not ignore the overwhelming sense of responsibility that had settled over him. Sarah was his daughter. Daniel was his grandson. And he could not walk away from that. Back at his apartment, the rain had started again, tapping gently against the windows as Michael stood in the dimly lit room, staring out at the city. His thoughts returned to Laura, her laugh, the way she used to look at him, the dreams they had once shared. He had spent years trying to preserve her memory, trying to keep her alive in some small way through his grief. But now, with Sarah's revelation, Michael was starting to wonder if he had ever really known Laura at all. Why had she hidden this from him? What had she been thinking during those final months of her life? The questions buzzed in his mind, relentless, demanding answers he was not sure he would ever find. Michael moved to his desk, where he kept a small collection of keepsakes from his time with Laura, old photos, letters, little trinkets that had once meant so much to them both. He picked up a photo of the two of them from their early days together. They looked so happy, so in love. Back when everything felt full of promise. He could not reconcile that version of Laura with the woman who had kept something so life-changing from him. Sitting down, Michael pulled out a worn notebook from the desk drawer. He had not touched it in years. It was Laura's journal, something she had kept on and off throughout their marriage. He had found it after she died but had never had the heart to read it, fearing it would only deepen his grief. Now, though, it felt like his only hope of understanding what had happened. With a deep breath, Michael opened the journal. The handwriting was familiar, the elegant script he had seen in countless notes and letters over the years. He flipped through the pages, reading her thoughts on mundane things, dinners they had shared, vacations they had taken. But nothing stood out. He was searching for something, anything that might explain why she had hidden Sarah from him. And then, buried toward the back of the journal, he found it. The entry was dated just a few months before Laura's death. As Michael's eyes scanned the page, his heart began to race. I do not know what to do. I am terrified. How could I let this happen now, after all these years? Michael would never understand. He is so focused on the business, on our future, and I cannot be the one to take that away from him. He deserves more than I can give him. I just wish I could tell him, but I know it would destroy him. I cannot let him see me like this. I cannot let him know. Michael's chest tightened as he read the words. Laura had been scared of how he would react, scared of how her pregnancy would affect their lives. But why had she not trusted him? Why had she thought he would not want to be part of it? The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Laura had not kept Sarah a secret because she did not want him to know, she had done it because she thought it was for his own good. She had been trying to protect him in her own way, shielding him from the burden of raising a child at a time when their lives were already complicated. Michael slumped back in his chair, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. It was not betrayal that had led Laura to keep Sarah from him, it was fear. Fear of how he would react. Fear of how it would change their lives. And maybe, in some small way, she had been trying to protect him from the pain she was feeling herself. But now, that decision had consequences. Sarah had grown up without knowing her father, and Michael had been robbed of the chance to be part of her life. And Daniel. Michael could not even begin to process the fact that he had a grandson. He closed the journal, his mind spinning. There was no way to change what had happened, no way to go back and fix the choices Laura had made. But there was still a path forward. Sarah had come to him, seeking answers, and now, more than ever, Michael knew he could not turn his back on her. He stood up, his resolve hardening. If there was one thing he could still do, it was be there for Sarah and Daniel. He had already lost too much time, and he was not about to lose any more. The next morning, Michael made a decision. He needed to reach out to Sarah. He had promised her he would try, and now, more than ever, he wanted to keep that promise. He was not sure how it would work or how they would navigate the complicated emotions between them. But he was willing to figure it out. He picked up the phone and dialed the number Sarah had given him. His heart raced as he waited for her to answer, unsure of what he would say when she did. After a few rings, Sarah's voice came through the line, soft but steady. Hello? Sarah? Michael began, his voice betraying the nervousness he felt. It is me, Michael. I have been thinking about everything, and I think we need to talk. There was a pause on the other end, and Michael held his breath, unsure of how she would respond. Finally, Sarah spoke. Yeah. I think we do. Michael exhaled, the tension in his chest easing slightly. It was not much, but it was a start. And right now, that was enough. The next time Michael saw Sarah, it was in a quiet corner of a small cafe, far from the bustling streets of the city. He had chosen the spot deliberately, intimate but neutral. Somewhere they could talk without the weight of the past hanging too heavily over them. He arrived early, nervously adjusting his shirt collar as he sat down at the table, waiting for her. His mind was still spinning with everything he had read in Laura's journal. It had brought him closer to understanding her, but it had also deepened the ache of not being able to ask her directly why she had made the choices she did. Michael looked up as Sarah entered the cafe, Daniel in her arms. She spotted him immediately and walked over, her face calm but cautious. There was a tension in her movements, like she was not sure how this was going to go. Hi, she said softly, settling into the chair across from him. She shifted Daniel in her arms, trying to make him comfortable before looking at Michael again. Thanks for meeting me. Michael nodded, his throat tightening with nerves. Of course, he said, his voice a little rougher than he intended. He glanced down at Daniel, who was looking up at him with wide eyes, curious but quiet. How is he? Sarah smiled faintly, brushing a hand over the baby's head. He is doing good, growing fast. There was a brief silence between them, either quite sure how to start the conversation that loomed over them. Michael cleared his throat, deciding it was best to just dive in. I have been thinking a lot about what you told me, Michael began, his voice low. And I found something that explains a little bit of why Laura did not tell me about you. Sarah raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued but guarded. What did you find? Michael hesitated for a moment, then reached into his jacket and pulled out Laura's journal. He slid it across the table towards Sarah. I found this. It is her journal. From the last year of her life. She wrote about her fears, her worries, why she kept you a secret. Sarah stared at the journal, her fingers grazing the edges of the cover but not opening it. She wrote about me? Michael nodded. She did not name you directly, but it is clear she was scared. Scared of how I would react. Scared of how having a child would affect our lives. She thought she was protecting me by keeping it from me. Sarah's expression softened. Her hand rested on the journal for a moment before she pulled it back. I have spent my whole life wondering why she did not want me, she said quietly, her voice tinged with a sadness Michael had not seen before. It is hard to hear that it was not just about me, that she was trying to protect you, too. Michael leaned forward, his eyes searching hers. It was not that she did not want you, Sarah. I can see now that she was overwhelmed. She did not know how to handle everything. But that does not mean she did not love you. I think she was just lost. Sarah let out a long breath, her shoulders sagging slightly. I guess I always imagined that if I found out why she gave me up, it would give me some kind of closure. But now it just feels complicated. Michael nodded. I know it is not easy. But the one thing I have learned is that you cannot change the past. You can only decide what to do with the present. There was a pause, and Michael could see the emotions flickering across Sarah's face, sadness, confusion, but also a hint of relief. It was as if hearing those words about her mother had lifted some of the weight she had been carrying for so long. I do not know what to do with all of this, Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I have spent so much time feeling angry at her. At you. And now I do not know what to feel. Michael's heart ached at the raw vulnerability in her voice. He wanted to say something, anything, to make it better. But he knew there were no simple answers. They were both navigating uncharted territory, trying to make sense of the mess that had been left behind. I get it, Michael said softly. I have been angry too. But maybe we can try to figure this out together. Sarah looked at him, her eyes searching his for some kind of reassurance. You really want to be a part of my life? After everything? I do, Michael said without hesitation. I have already lost so much time, Sarah. I do not want to lose any more. If you are willing to give this a chance, I am too. Sarah was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. I am willing to try. But I need time, Michael. This is a lot to take in. Michael reached across the table, his hand hovering near hers but not quite touching it. I understand. We will take it one step at a time. There is no rush. Sarah glanced at Daniel, who had fallen asleep in her arms, then back at Michael. He does not have a grandfather, you know? She said softly, a hint of a smile on her lips. Michael's heart swelled. I would like to change that, Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek before she quickly wiped it away. I think Daniel would like that too. For the first time in years, Michael felt a flicker of hope. It was fragile, but it was there. He had spent so long believing that his life had ended when Laura died, that there was no way forward. But now, sitting here with Sarah and Daniel, he realized that there was still something left to fight for. They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of their shared past hanging in the air. But there was also something new, a tentative connection, a chance at rebuilding what had been lost. As they left the cafe, Michael walked beside Sarah, feeling the warmth of the sun breaking through the clouds for the first time that day. It was a small, almost imperceptible change. But it felt like a sign. And for the first time in years, Michael allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the future could hold something more. The days that followed their meeting at the cafe were filled with cautious optimism. Michael and Sarah began to see more of each other, though always with a certain hesitance in the air, as if they were both afraid of saying or doing something that would break the fragile bond they were starting to form. Michael, for his part, was determined to show Sarah that he was serious about being part of her life. But he also understood her need for space. It was not easy. Every time he looked at her, he was reminded of how much he had missed, how much time had slipped through his fingers. And as much as he wanted to embrace this new chapter, the past still weighed heavily on his mind. His thoughts often returned to Laura and the choices she had made. He had spent so many years idealizing her, putting her on a pedestal, that it was difficult to reconcile the image of the woman he had loved with the one who had kept such a life-altering secret from him. One evening, after a particularly long day, Michael sat in his living room, nursing a glass of whiskey. He had not seen Sarah for a few days, and while he wanted to reach out to her, he was also trying to respect her boundaries. It was a delicate balance, one he was not entirely sure how to navigate. He knew that pushing too hard might drive her away, but not pushing hard enough felt like he was letting the opportunity slip away again. His phone buzzed on the table beside him, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Sarah. "Can we talk tomorrow? There is something I need to tell you." Michael's heart skipped a beat. The message was simple, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. He quickly typed out a reply, agreeing to meet her, and then sat back, his mind racing with possibilities. What could she need to tell him? Was it something about Daniel? Or maybe something about Laura? Some new piece of the puzzle that would help him understand everything better? The next morning, they met at a park not far from Sarah's apartment. Daniel was with her, bundled up in his stroller, and as Michael approached, he could see the tension in Sarah's posture. She smiled when she saw him, but it did not quite reach her eyes. "Hey," she said, her voice soft but strained. "Thanks for meeting me." "Of course," Michael replied, his concern growing. "What is going on?" Sarah gestured to a nearby bench, and they sat down, facing the lake in front of them. The water was calm, reflecting the clear blue sky above, but the atmosphere between them was far from peaceful. Michael could sense that whatever Sarah had to say, it was weighing heavily on her. "I have been thinking a lot," Sarah began, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "About everything, about you, about my mom, about Daniel. And there is something I have not told you yet." Michael's heart pounded in his chest. He tried to keep his expression calm, but he could feel the tension building inside him. "You can tell me anything, Sarah. Whatever it is, we will figure it out." Sarah nodded, but she did not look at him. Instead, she kept her eyes fixed on the lake, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have always wondered why my mom did not tell you about me. I thought maybe it was because she did not want to burden you or because she was scared of how you would react. But I found something recently, something that might explain it." Michael's breath caught in his throat. "What did you find?" Sarah hesitated for a moment before reaching into her bag and pulling out a small folded piece of paper. She handed it to Michael, her eyes finally meeting his, and he could see the mixture of fear and sadness in them. Michael unfolded the paper carefully, his hands trembling slightly. It was a letter, an old, worn letter, with the edges fraying and the ink slightly faded. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Laura's. He began to read, his heart pounding in his chest as the words came into focus. "Michael, I do not know if you will ever read this, but I need to write it anyway. I have been keeping something from you, something that I am not sure I will ever have the courage to tell you in person. I am pregnant, and I am terrified. I know you have always said you did not want children, and I have respected that. But now, with this news, I do not know what to do. I do not want to lose you, but I also do not want to burden you with something you never wanted. So I am making the choice to keep this from you, not because I do not love you, but because I do. I hope, one day, you will forgive me for this." Michael's hands shook as he finished reading. He stared at the letter, his mind unable to process the words. Laura had been pregnant, and she had known. She had made the decision to keep it from him because she thought it was what he wanted, because of something he had said years ago, before they were even married. "I do not understand," Michael whispered, his voice barely audible. "I never told her I did not want children. I mean, maybe I said it in passing when we were younger, but I never meant it like that. I thought we would figure it out together." Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with sympathy. "I think she was just scared, Michael. She did not want to lose you, and she thought this was the only way to keep you." Michael shook his head, the weight of the revelation crashing down on him. Michael had spent all these years believing that he and Laura had been on the same page, that they had understood each other perfectly. But now he realized that they had been living with different fears, different expectations, and those unspoken things had torn them apart in ways he could never have imagined. "I did not know," Michael said, his voice breaking. "If I had known, I would have been there for her. I would have been there for you." Sarah placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but grounding. "I know. And maybe she did too deep down. But she made the choice she thought was right at the time, and now we are here." Michael's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, he could not speak. The pain of what had been lost, of what could have been, was almost too much to bear. But Sarah was right. They could not change the past. All they could do was move forward. He looked at Sarah, the daughter he had never known, and then at Daniel, the grandson who had been brought into his life so unexpectedly. "I do not want to waste any more time," Michael said finally, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. "I want to be part of your life, Sarah. I want to be there for Daniel. I do not care how complicated it is. We will figure it out." Sarah smiled through her own tears, nodding slowly. "I want that too." They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of the past still heavy, but the hope for the future finally starting to break through. It was not going to be easy. There were still so many questions, so much to process. But for the first time, Michael felt like they were both ready to take the next step, together. The days after their conversation in the park passed slowly for Michael. His mind kept returning to the letter Sarah had shown him. Laura's words haunted him. She had made a decision based on a fear he had not even realized existed, and that fear had changed the course of both their lives forever. Michael had always seen himself as in control of his life, his choices, his emotions. But now, faced with the consequences of unspoken desires and misunderstood fears, he was left grappling with the enormity of it all. One evening, Michael sat in his study, nursing a drink and staring at Laura's journal and the letter Sarah had given him. The faint hum of the city outside provided a strange backdrop to the silence in the room. He felt trapped between the past and the present, unsure how to reconcile the life he had once believed in with the truth that had come to light. He had wanted children. He remembered thinking about it, imagining a future where he and Laura would raise a family together. But life had gotten in the way, his career, their travels, the endless possibilities of their busy lives. Children had always been something they would get around to discussing later. But later never came. The real blow, though, was knowing that his own words, spoken offhandedly years ago, had been enough to drive Laura to keep such a life-changing secret. Michael did not even remember the conversation clearly. They had been young, not long after getting together, and he had probably said something about not wanting kids right away, maybe even never. But he had never meant it as a final decision. He had assumed they would discuss it properly one day. But that day never came, and Laura had made her choice alone. Michael took a deep breath, staring down at the papers in front of him. He did not know how to feel about Laura anymore. The grief he had carried for so long was being replaced by something more complex, a mixture of love, anger, and regret. He still loved her. He always would. But now, that love was tangled up with a deep sense of loss, not just for her, but for the life they could have had together, for the family they could have built. And then there was Sarah, the daughter he had never known, the child Laura had kept from him in an attempt to protect him from a burden he would have gladly accepted. Michael wanted to be there for her, to make up for lost time. But he did not know how to bridge the gap between them. They were strangers, connected by blood but separated by years of silence and secrets. As much as he wanted to jump into this new role, father, grandfather, he knew it was not that simple. Sarah had her own life, her own experiences, and her own pain. He could not just walk in and expect to fill a void that had existed for years. He would have to earn her trust, earn his place in her life. And that was not something that could happen overnight. The phone on his desk buzzed, pulling Michael out of his thoughts. It was a message from Sarah. "Are you free tomorrow? Daniel has a doctor's appointment in the afternoon, and I was wondering if you wanted to come with us. No pressure, just thought you might want to be there." Michael stared at the screen, his heart swelling with both anxiety and hope. Sarah was reaching out. She was offering him a chance to be part of her and Daniel's life, to take the first steps toward building something new together. He quickly typed a response, trying not to overthink it. "I would love to come. Just let me know the time." As soon as he hit send, a sense of relief washed over him. It was not much, but it was a start. He was not sure what to expect or how it would feel to step into this new role, but he was willing to try. For Sarah. For Daniel. For the family he had lost, and the one he still had a chance to be part of. The next day, Michael met Sarah outside the pediatrician's office. She was standing by the entrance, Daniel bundled up in his stroller, looking both relieved and nervous to see him. Michael could not help but smile as he walked up to them. Daniel's big eyes blinked up at him from under his hat, and for a moment, all of Michael's doubts melted away. "Hey," Sarah said, her voice soft but welcoming. "Thanks for coming." "Of course," Michael replied, crouching down to get a closer look at Daniel. "How is the little guy doing?" "He is good, a bit fussy, but nothing unusual." Sarah smiled faintly as she adjusted Daniel's blanket. "I thought it might be nice for you to be here, to get to know him a little." Michael's heart warmed at her words. He knew it was not easy for her to offer this. Sarah had her walls up, and for good reason, but she was trying. And that was more than he could have asked for. They walked into the office together, making small talk as they waited for Daniel's appointment. Michael found himself watching Sarah, noticing the way she interacted with her son, the tenderness in her voice, the way she seemed to understand his every need. It was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. He could not help but wonder what it would have been like if he had been there for her from the beginning. But there was no use dwelling on the past. He was here now, and that was what mattered. The doctor's appointment was routine, just a quick checkup. But for Michael, it felt monumental. As he sat beside Sarah, watching the doctor weigh and measure Daniel, he realized these were the moments he had been missing out on all his life. The simple, everyday moments of being a parent, of watching a child grow and learn. It was not glamorous or grand, but it was real. It was the kind of connection he had longed for without even realizing it. When the appointment was over and they were walking back out into the crisp afternoon air, Michael turned to Sarah, feeling a lump rise in his throat. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet but sincere, "for letting me be part of this." Sarah looked at him, her eyes softening. "You are welcome. I want you to be part of it. I know it is not going to be easy, but I think we can figure it out." Michael nodded, feeling the weight of her words. They were on the same page, both cautious but hopeful, both willing to take the steps necessary to build something together. As they stood there, watching the sunset behind the city skyline, Michael allowed himself to believe that maybe, despite everything, there was still time to heal. Time to make amends. Time to be the father and grandfather he had always wanted to be. As the days turned into weeks, Michael began to feel a sense of cautious optimism growing inside him. He had started spending more time with Sarah and Daniel, finding a rhythm in their interactions that felt both unfamiliar and comforting. The initial awkwardness of their new relationship was slowly beginning to fade, replaced by a fragile but genuine connection. Michael had been careful not to overstep, allowing Sarah to set the pace while making it clear that he was fully committed to being part of their lives. One afternoon, Sarah invited Michael to her apartment for the first time. It was a modest place, small but cozy, and as Michael stepped inside, he could see the care Sarah had put into making it a home for her and Daniel. Toys were scattered on the living room floor, and a soft blanket was draped over the couch. The apartment smelled faintly of baby lotion and freshly brewed coffee. "Make yourself comfortable," Sarah said, motioning toward the couch as she took Daniel out of his stroller. "I will get us some coffee." Michael nodded, sitting down and looking around the room. He felt a strange mixture of emotions: pride in seeing the life Sarah had built for herself, but also a deep sense of regret that he had not been there to witness any of it. He had missed so much, and no matter how hard he tried to move forward, that sense of loss would always linger. As Sarah disappeared into the kitchen, Michael's gaze drifted to a small photo frame on the bookshelf. It was a picture of Sarah holding Daniel, both of them smiling at the camera, their eyes bright with joy. It was a simple image, but it hit Michael hard. He realized that he was looking at the family he never knew he had. A family he was only now beginning to understand. Sarah returned a few moments later, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. She handed one to Michael and sat down across from him, adjusting Daniel on her lap. The baby cooed softly, his chubby hands reaching for his mother's hair. "So," Sarah said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I have been thinking a lot lately, about everything, about us, about Mom. And there is something else I think you should know." Michael looked up from his coffee, his heart rate picking up slightly. He had grown used to the idea that there would always be new revelations when it came to Laura and Sarah's past, but that did not make them any easier to hear. "What is it?" he asked carefully. Sarah took a deep breath, her fingers absent-mindedly playing with Daniel's tiny hand. "After we talked about Mom and why she kept me a secret from you, I started digging a little deeper. I wanted to understand more about her life, about why she made the choices she did. And I found something that, well, it changes things." Michael frowned, setting his mug down on the coffee table. "What do you mean?" Sarah hesitated for a moment before standing up and walking over to the bookshelf. She pulled out a small box that Michael had not noticed before, bringing it back to the couch and setting it between them. "This," Sarah said quietly, opening the box, "was in Mom's things. It is a letter, but it is not from her. It is from someone else. Someone I think you knew." Michael's stomach tightened as Sarah handed him the letter. He unfolded it slowly, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. It was addressed to Laura, but the signature at the bottom made Michael's heart stop. It was from someone named James. Not just any James, but James Porter, an old friend of Michael's from his younger days. The two had lost touch over the years, but they had been close once, long before Michael had met Laura. As he read the letter, Michael's blood ran cold. "Laura, I do not know if I will ever have the courage to send this to you, but I need to put it down on paper, even if only for my own peace of mind. I know we have kept this secret for so long, but it is weighing on me now more than ever. Michael has no idea about what happened between us, and I cannot bear to keep pretending. I am not asking you to tell him. I know how complicated things are, but I need you to know that I have never stopped thinking about you, about what we had. If things were different, I would have fought harder for you, but I know you made your choice. I just hope you are happy, even if it is not with me. With love, James." Michael's hands trembled as he finished reading. He stared at the letter, his mind reeling. James and Laura, had they been together? Had there been something between them that he had never known about? Sarah watched him carefully, her expression full of empathy. "I did not want to tell you right away," she said softly. "I was not sure how you would take it. But I thought you deserved to know." Michael could not find the words. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the revelation crashing over him like a tidal wave. The letter Sarah had found was always on Michael's mind. It raised so many questions. Had Laura loved James? Had it been a brief affair, or something more serious? And why had James never told him the truth? More than anything, Michael felt a deep sense of betrayal. He had trusted both of them, Laura as his wife and James as one of his closest friends. But now, that trust felt shattered, replaced by a gnawing doubt that would not go away. The next morning, Michael made a decision. He needed answers. He could not live with the uncertainty any longer. After some searching, he found James' contact information. They had not spoken in years, not since they had drifted apart after Laura's death. But this was not something Michael could let go of. He had to confront him. With his heart pounding in his chest, Michael dialed the number. It rang a few times before a familiar voice answered. Hello? James' voice was older, more tired than Michael remembered. But it was unmistakable. James, Michael said, his voice tight. It is Michael Carter. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Michael could hear the hesitation in James' voice when he finally responded. Michael. It has been a long time. It has, Michael agreed, keeping his tone calm even though the tension was building inside him. I need to talk to you about Laura. Another pause. Laura? James' voice was cautious. Almost as if he knew what was coming. What about her? I found a letter, Michael said, his words sharp now. A letter you wrote to her, about something that happened between the two of you. I think you know what I am talking about. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Michael could feel the weight of it, the unspoken truth hanging between them. When James finally spoke, his voice was low, almost resigned. I did not think you would ever find out. Michael clenched his jaw, the confirmation hitting him hard. So it is true, then? You and Laura, what was it, James? An affair? A one-time thing? James let out a heavy sigh. It was not like that, Michael. It was not an affair. It was complicated. Michael's anger flared. Complicated? That is all you have to say? I trusted you, James. You were my friend. I know, James replied, his voice filled with regret. I never wanted to hurt you, Michael, and I do not think Laura did either. What happened between us, it was a mistake, but it was not what you think. Michael's grip tightened on the phone. Then tell me what it was. Because from where I am standing, it looks like both of you kept a pretty big secret from me. James hesitated again, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost defeated. It was a long time ago. Before you and Laura were even serious. We had a brief thing, but it ended. Laura chose you, Michael. She loved you. Whatever happened between us, it was over long before you two got married. Michael's heart pounded in his chest. It was over, but it did not make the betrayal any easier to swallow. Why did neither of you tell me? I do not know, James admitted. At first, it did not seem like it mattered. It was in the past, and we both moved on. But as time went on, I guess we were both afraid of what it would do to you, to your marriage. And then after Laura died, I could not bring myself to tell you. I did not want to add to your pain. Michael shook his head, his anger simmering just below the surface. You think keeping it from me was better? You think I would not have wanted to know the truth? James' voice was filled with regret. I do not know, Michael. I thought I was doing the right thing at the time. But looking back, maybe I should have told you. Michael felt his chest tighten. He wanted to yell, to unleash the anger and frustration that had been building inside him since he had read the letter. But at the same time, he felt exhausted. The weight of all these secrets, all these lies, was overwhelming. I do not know what to say to you, James, Michael said finally, his voice strained. I do not even know how to process this. I understand, James replied quietly. I am sorry, Michael. I truly am. If I could go back and change things, I would. But all I can do now is apologize and hope you can find it in yourself to forgive me. Forgiveness. Michael was not sure if he was capable of that right now. The betrayal felt too fresh, too raw. But part of him knew that holding on to the anger would not bring him peace either. I do not know if I can forgive you, James, Michael said honestly. But I appreciate you telling me the truth. There was a long pause before James spoke again. If you ever want to talk, I am here. I know it is a lot to take in, but I am willing to answer any questions you have. Michael was not sure if he wanted to hear more. He was not sure if he wanted to dig any deeper into a past that had already caused him so much pain. But he knew one thing. He needed time. Time to process. Time to heal. I need some time, Michael said finally. I do not know what comes next, but I need to figure that out. Take all the time you need, James replied softly. I'm sorry, Michael. Truly. The call ended, and Michael stood there for a long time, the phone still in his hand, his mind swirling with conflicting emotions. He had the truth now, or at least part of it. But it did not bring the closure he had hoped for. If anything, it only made him feel more lost. Later that evening, Michael sat down with Sarah to tell her about the conversation with James. She listened quietly, her face unreadable, but he could see the same conflicted emotions playing out behind her eyes. I am not sure what to think anymore, Michael admitted, his voice heavy with exhaustion. I thought finding out the truth would help, but now I just feel lost. Sarah nodded, her hand resting gently on Daniel's back as he dozed in her arms. I get it. I have been struggling with the same thing. But maybe the truth is not always about closure. Maybe it is just about understanding the past so we can figure out how to move forward. Michael looked at her, feeling a surge of gratitude for her presence in his life. Despite everything, they were still here, together, facing the uncertainty of the future. And maybe that was enough for now. I think you are right, Michael said quietly. I do not know what comes next, but I want to figure it out with you. Sarah smiled softly, her eyes warm with understanding. We will figure it out. One step at a time. As Michael sat there with his daughter and grandson, he realized that despite the pain and confusion of the past, there was still something worth fighting for. The truth had been messy, complicated, and heartbreaking, but it had also brought him closer to Sarah and Daniel. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope for the future. But Michael had also started to see that the past, as painful as it was, could not be changed. What mattered now was how he chose to live with it, and what he did with the time he had left. Sarah had been a constant presence through it all. Their relationship, though still fragile, was growing stronger with each passing day. She had allowed him into her life, into Daniel's life, and in doing so, she had given Michael a reason to keep moving forward. One afternoon, Michael found himself at the park with Sarah and Daniel. It was a warm day, the sun casting a golden hue over the grass as they strolled along the path. Daniel was in his stroller, babbling happily as Sarah pushed him along. Michael walked beside them, feeling a sense of peace that had been absent from his life for so long. They reached a bench near the lake, and Sarah gestured for Michael to sit. She unbuckled Daniel from the stroller and set him on her lap, smiling as he squirmed excitedly at the sight of the ducks swimming by. Hard to believe how much he has grown already, Michael said, watching Daniel with a smile. Yeah, it feels like just yesterday he was a tiny baby, Sarah replied, her voice soft with affection. She glanced at Michael, her expression thoughtful. I am really glad you are here, Michael. I know it has not been easy, but I am glad we are figuring this out together. Michael felt a lump rise in his throat. He had been waiting for this moment, for some kind of acknowledgement that they were moving in the right direction. I am glad, too, he said quietly. I know I have made mistakes, and there is a lot I wish I could go back and change, but I am grateful for this, for you and Daniel. Sarah nodded, her eyes meeting his with a warmth that had not been there when they first met. I know it has been hard for both of us, but we are here now, and I think that is what matters. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the ducks glide across the water. Michael's mind wandered back to everything that had led him to this moment, the grief, the secrets, the painful revelations, but for the first time, he was not weighed down by it. Instead, he felt a sense of clarity. I have been thinking a lot, Michael said after a while, breaking the silence. About the past, about everything that happened, And I realize that holding on to the anger and the hurt, it is not helping anyone. I do not know if I will ever fully understand why Laura made the choices she did, but I think I am ready to let go of the need for answers. Sarah looked at him, her expression soft but serious. That is a big step, Michael. I know how hard it has been for you. Michael nodded. It has, but I do not want the past to define what happens next. I want to focus on what we have now, on being there for you and Daniel. Sarah smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude. That means a lot to me, Michael. I know this has not been easy for any of us, but I think you are right. We cannot change the past, but we can move forward. Michael felt a sense of relief wash over him. It was not that the pain had disappeared. He knew it would always be there, lingering beneath the surface. But it no longer felt like a burden he could not carry. He had found something else, something stronger, a purpose. As they continued to sit by the lake, Sarah shifted in her seat, her voice hesitant but filled with hope. You know, I have been thinking too, about Daniel. He is going to need a lot of people in his life who care about him, who love him. And I think you could be a big part of that, if you want to be. Michael's heart swelled at her words. I want that more than anything, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I want to be part of his life, part of your life. Sarah smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. I am really glad to hear that, because I think he could use a grandfather. The word hit Michael with an unexpected force, but in the best possible way. Grandfather. It was a role he had never imagined for himself, especially after all the years of solitude and grief. But now, it felt like the most important role he could ever have. I would be honored, Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. I do not know how good I will be at it, but I am willing to try. Sarah laughed softly, her hand resting on Daniel's tiny foot. That is all we can do, right? Just try. They sat together, watching Daniel as he giggled at the ducks, and for the first time in a long time, Michael felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Over the next few months, Michael's life continued to shift in ways he never thought possible. He and Sarah grew closer, navigating their complicated relationship with honesty and patience. There were still moments of tension, still questions that lingered between them, but they were learning to face those challenges together. Michael also became more involved in Daniel's life. He found himself looking forward to the time he spent with his grandson, whether it was taking him to the park, reading him stories, or simply watching him explore the world with wide-eyed wonder. It was a new kind of joy, one that Michael had not realized he was capable of feeling. And through it all, Michael learned to let go of the anger and the bitterness that had once consumed him. He made peace with the fact that he would never have all the answers about Laura, and that some things were better left in the past. What mattered now was the future, the life he was building with Sarah and Daniel, the family he was rediscovering. One evening, as Michael sat in his apartment, looking out over the city skyline, he realized how much had changed. The loneliness that had once defined him was no longer there. In its place was a sense of connection, of belonging, that he had not felt in years. He still visited Laura's grave from time to time, but the visits were different now. They were less about mourning and more about reflecting. He had loved her deeply, and that love would always be a part of him. But he also knew that he had to let her go, to make room for the life he had found with Sarah and Daniel. As the sun set over the city, casting a warm glow over the skyline, Michael felt a quiet contentment settle over him. It was not the life he had imagined all those years ago. But it was a life he had come to cherish. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that the future, no matter how uncertain, could be filled with hope.